So good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Meadows Museum tonight. Can I please ask that everyone silence your cell phone at this time? Our speaker this evening is Roger Rothman, professor in the Department of Art and Art History at Bucknell University. Professor Rothman has taught at Bucknell since 2003, and prior to that post, he has taught at Agnes Scott College, Sarah Lawrence College, the School of Visual Art in New York, and the Parsons School of Design. He holds an MFA from Hunter College and a PhD from Columbia University. Professor Rothman's teaching covers modern and contemporary art from the 19th century to the present. As a senior fellow in the Arts Residential College, he has taught foundation seminars on the art of Marcel Duchamp and other avant-garde artists of the early 20th century. Professor Rothman has published numerous articles on Cubism, Dadaism, Surrealism, and Fluxus in such journals as Modernism, Modernity, The Space Between, French Cultural Studies, Word and Image, the Journal of Aesthetics, and Art Criticism. He has also contributed to the publication Modernism and Theory, A Critical Debate. He has a forthcoming publication titled Uncritical, Fluxus and the Rise of an Affirmative Avant-Garde. His book, Tiny Surrealism, Salvador Dali and the Aesthetics of the Small, was published by University of Nebraska Press in 2012, and we do have copies of the book in the gift shop this evening. And it is, of course, his work on Dalí and his emphasis on the small things that prompted us to invite him to speak this evening with his talk, Salvador Dali's Surrealism of the Tiny. So please join me in welcoming Roger Rothman.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Scott. Let's see, now we have to find the PowerPoint.
Let's do that. I forget what I'm doing. That's my phone. I swear it's...
Someone forgot to silence their cell phone.
It's on silent, but a video came up. Sorry. I'm going to go turn my phone off.
Thank you. I had to turn mine off because I don't trust that mine will really be silent. All right, thank you very much. Let me know if you can't hear me in the back. I assume you can. Yes, in the back. Good, very good. All right, thank you again for inviting me to come and speak about the work of Salvador Dalí. I would like to start this evening begin by putting my paper today within a broader context of my thinking about modern art in general. My writing on Salvador Dalí stems from a more general interest in examining artists whose work doesn't fit the mainstream narrative of modernism. That is, the story of modern art that we're taught in survey classes, the story that appears in textbooks, and that was in many instances told by the artists themselves. This is the story exemplified by the three paintings I'm showing you here. On the left, Berthe Morisot's painting of a woman sewing from 1879, Pablo Picasso's Head of a Woman, likely a portrait of Fernande Olivier, Picasso's mistress at the time, which dates to 1909, and on the right, one of Wassily Kandinsky's breakthrough abstractions from 1913. What has long interested me is the fact that although the vast majority of celebrated modern painters like Morisot, Picasso, and Kandinsky, followed in one way or another this trajectory from figuration to abstraction, this mainstream of modernism. But, however, there are a few important examples in which this logic of anti-illusionism clearly does not apply. In fact, it runs in reverse. It was in pursuit of such puzzling reversals that I was drawn to artists like Giorgio de Chirico, Francis Picabia, and René Magritte. To give you a brief glimpse of the puzzle, here are two paintings by Magritte, Violinist from 1920 and Time Transfixed from 1938. Now, interestingly, the abstract painting on the left was painted before the realistic one on the right. And my work on Magritte has been an effort to determine whether or not there was any meaning to this artist's return to the practice of art as imitation. Was Magritte in some way engaged in a critique of mainstream modernism? And if so, what sort of critique? Does the technique itself function as a bearer of meaning, just as the techniques of Morisot, Picasso, and Kandinsky, and that is Impressionism, Cubism, and abstraction, are all understood as carrying meanings? In other words, to what extent can it be said that Magritte's work is as much a function of its style as it is its subject matter? These are the sorts of questions that led me to the paintings of Salvador Dali. Like Magritte, Dali is famous, and for some infamous, for having renounced modernism and its pursuit of anti-illusionism in favor of a return to traditional techniques of figurative representation. Here, for example, are two paintings by Dali that present us with the same stylistic conundrum as the pair of Magrittes in the last slide. On the left, we see a self-portrait that Dali painted in 1923. I'm sorry, I'm turning around. I'm used to having like a little cheat monitor right here that's telling me exactly what you all are looking at. If I come off by 4 or 5 slides, it'll be a total disaster. Okay, so on the left, we see a self-portrait from 1923, and on the right, the painting that inspired this very exhibition of Dali's work, The Fishman, which Dali painted in 1930, 7 years after completing the work on the left. The question that interests me and that I'd like to address here is what to make of Dali's about face. What to make of Dali's rejection of the Cubist style we see on the left for a return to the old master techniques of illusionistic representation deployed in the work on the right. The issue of context is, of course, especially important. In order to understand what mainstream modernist painters like Morisot, Picasso, and Kandinsky were doing, we have to understand their work within the context of the academic tradition against which they were reacting. The works of the old masters are thus the backdrop or horizon of expectation, to use Hans Jaus's term, against which the innovations of modern painters become comprehensible as innovations. Transposing this issue of context onto Dali, the question becomes this. When looking at Dali's paintings, are we to understand modernism, that is the work on the left, as the horizon of expectation against which these works become visible? If the answer to that question is yes, then I think it means we need to change the way we think about Dali's paintings. Because at the moment, and in fact really since they first appeared, the question of Dali's style of painting hasn't drawn nearly as much attention as the question of Dali's imagery. By most accounts, Dali's style is best understood, as one historian put it, as an expedient. In other words, Dali's style is purely functional. It simply serves as a means of illustrating his ideas about the unconscious. And it is this idea, or so the argument goes, that is Dali's real concern, that is the unconscious. A few have acknowledged that Dali's style serves a somewhat more substantive purpose, and have suggested that rather than a mere expedient, it should be understood like a lure, or in the business world, a loss leader in a supermarket or drugstore. Following this line of thinking, Dali's style is the attractively priced item that draws the customer to the store so that once inside, they end up purchasing the things the store is really most interested in selling. And these not the loss leaders are the items that actually make a profit for the business. Here, Dali's style is understood not so much as an expedient as it is a hook by which the viewer is pulled towards the painting, and once caught by it, compelled to fix her eyes on the things that really matter, that is, the strange, confounding, and mesmerizing objects that Dali has painted. In this case, the man's head and chest composed of a clock and a pile of fish, as well as a shoe. It seems to me, however, that at least sometimes in Dali's work, if not most of the time, it is in fact the imagery, the fish, the clocks, the shoes, that play the role of the lure, and that what really mesmerizes is not the painting's imagery, but its style. One of the ways to move towards an understanding of Dali's ideas about style is through the painter's lifelong fascination with the work of the Dutch Baroque painter Jan Vermeer. Dali often insisted that Vermeer, a painter of moralizing allegories and scenes of tender sentiment, was actually a surrealist avant la lettre. Dali did not consider him a surrealist because of his imagery, of course. If he had been interested in finding an historical painter who'd been drawn, as the surrealists were, to scenes of eroticism, violence, and the irrational realm of the dream world, he would have made reference instead to the paintings of Hieronymus Bosch, or those of Henri Fuseli, who you see here. If Vermeer is a surrealist, it can't be for what he painted. Which raises the question, does Vermeer's surrealism lie in the way that he painted? But here, too, there's something strange about attributing to Vermeer the technique of surrealism. For there are no signs of expressive strokes of paint in Vermeer's work, no indication that the drives of the unconscious are in any way responsible for those refined and restrained works of meticulous organization and craftsmanship. So what then did Dalí mean when he declared Vermeer to be the most surrealist of them all? Throughout the 20s, Dalí absorbed with tremendous speed and apparent voraciousness the full range of modernist styles. On the top left, in a work from 1921 entitled Lane to Port Legat, Dalí has adopted an early impressionist style. Next to it, in the landscape from 1922, he seems to have been looking at the works by Van Gogh and Gauguin and others. In the third painting on the top, you again see Dalí's Cubist painting of 1923, and next to that, a still life from 1924 that was influenced, as I'm sure many of you can tell, if not all, by the Italian painter Giorgio Morandi. On the bottom row on the left is Venus and Sailor from 1925, a work derived from Picasso's neoclassical period of the late teens and early 20s. Next to it, a drawing from 1926 adopts the working methods of surrealist automatism as practiced by André Masson and others. Next to that, the work from 1927 draws on the surrealist paintings of Jean Miro and Max Ernst. And the last piece, from 1928 on the far right, which includes a piece of cork attached to the canvas, is a work that owes almost everything to the abstract constructions of Jean Arp. So it goes from Impressionism to Cubism to Neoclassicism to automatism and abstraction, from Gauguin to Picasso, Morandi, Masson, Miro, and Arp. Like so many modern painters of his generation, Dalí spent his formative years recapitulating the history of modernism, from illusionism to abstraction. Dalí's rapid careening from one influence to another, as one critic put it at the time, is evident even in individual works themselves, such as Little Ashes from 1928. This work reads like a catalog of almost every artist and movement that Dalí had been drawn to over the previous 5 to 10 years. There are signs of Cubism and Neoclassicism in what I've labeled as number 1, of Surrealism, of Miro, Ernst, and Tanguy in detail 2, and of the sorts of architectonic forms used by Giorgio de Chirico, detail number 3. There's also an element I haven't mentioned, an element that has no correlation to any of the modern movements I've mentioned so far, the nude torso and buttocks depicted in the painting's center in the foreground. It is rendered in precisely the style that modernism strove to eradicate. It's painted slickly, with great attention to modeling and the texture of flesh. Ironically, it would be this small detail that would become the single characteristic feature of Dalí's mature style. If not taken from Vermeer in particular, the torso is neither derived from the lessons of the old masters, the torso is nonetheless derived from the lessons of the old masters of the Renaissance and Baroque, lessons maintained through the 19th century, lessons emphatically rejected by the very painters referred to elsewhere in this painting. Another clue to the sense of significance of Dalí's anti-modernist style comes from his letters to his close friend, the poet Federico Garcia Lorca. These letters, written between 1925 and 1928, when the two were closest, contain a wealth of information about Dalí's developing aesthetic and his ambivalent attachment to modernism on the one hand and the old masters on the other. Of the letters that remain, one of the earliest was written in the summer of 1925, a time when Dalí was working on paintings like Venus and Sailor, which you see here on the left. A work, as I mentioned earlier, that was clearly derived from Picasso's neo-cubist, post-cubist neoclassical style. Like Ingres' painting in the 19th century, Poussin's paintings in the 17th century, and before that the Renaissance revival of classical art, Picasso's neoclassical paintings of the 1920s were part of a long history of periodic returns to Greek and Roman prototypes. In Picasso's case, and I'm showing you an example from 1922, a few salient elements, both iconographic and formal, are reconceived in light of lessons drawn from Cubism. The result was a reconciliation of the modern with the historical, innovation fused with tradition. And it was part of a complex and quite widespread post-war reaction against what was seen as the excesses of the pre-war avant-garde and its uncompromising hostility towards tradition, exemplified most aggressively by the Italian futurists. As you can see in the painting by Dalí on the left, the woman is dressed in the same garb as the woman in Picasso's painting, a classical shift, and her profile is rendered as a stereotypically Greco-Roman form. At the same time, however, she's represented as a collection of blocky shapes and emphatic angles that recall the fractured forms of Cubist painting. And these elements are in turn reiterated in the lines and shapes that define the sailor and the barren seashore in the background. In a letter to Lorca from the summer of 1925, Dalí described his working process as one might expect. He wrote that he'd been thinking a lot about Cézanne, the painter who was the principal inspiration behind Cubism. He quotes Cézanne's most famous and explicitly neoclassical phrase, faire du Poussin d'après nature, to remake Poussin after nature. In other words, Dalí's paintings and thoughts about his paintings at this time are exactly what one would expect from an ambitious and perspicacious, yet still orthodox student of modernism circa 1920. But just 10 months later, in March 1926, Dalí wrote again to Lorca, this time with a tone of someone struggling to convince an incredulous witness. Believe me, sir, the greatest painter that ever was is Vermeer of Delft. Now, Dalí doesn't elaborate in his letter on what it is about Vermeer that makes him the greatest painter that ever was, but his next sentence, in which he returns to a description of his current work in progress, offers by implication the beginnings of an answer to this question. He writes to Lorca, I am painting a picture of a girl. For the past 5 days, I've painted devotedly, patiently, the back of her newly shaved neck, and it's coming off very well. So well that it almost doesn't look modern or old, though it is. You could spend a lot of time trying to figure out what he means by doesn't look, although it is, though it is not. At the same time, a profound ambivalence to understanding how his paintings fit within the discourse of modern art. Now, the painting Dalí is likely referring to in this letter is this painting here, Girl's Back, dated 1926. And he writes, 5 days painting this girl's back. That's a long time for a painting that's only 12.5 inches high. Now, that means that the painting is only a fraction larger than Vermeer's Lace Maker, a painting Dalí had recently seen during his trip to Paris. Now, if we resize Girl's Back and the Lace Maker relative to Venus and Sailor, the three paintings look like this. According to his letter, Dalí spent 5 days painting the tiny area that makes up the girl's back. It's not difficult to see why he would have described his attention to this little patch of canvas as patient and devoted. Indeed, it's hard to imagine it could have been painted in any other fashion. Now, Girl's Back is in some aspects wholly unlike Vermeer's work. It depicts a dramatically spare environment and glows with an intensity more akin to the Spanish still lifes of Zurbarán, Coton, and Melendez. Dalí doesn't mention these painters in either his public texts or private correspondences, but I don't think that it's out of a wish to hide their influence or because he himself is unaware of their work. What letters like this one to Lorca point out is that for Dalí it is a certain idea about Vermeer that attracts him. For then as now, the image of Vermeer, a painter who has only 24 works to his name, was one of a remarkable exception, an outsider who practiced in a way at odds with his generation. He was then, as today, held up as a uniquely slow-working, patient painter. Dalí's reference, then, to painting devotedly and patiently is thus as much a reference to the myth of Vermeer as it is to the paintings themselves. There was no doubt, however, that Dalí was fascinated by the tiny size of Vermeer's paintings and the near invisibility of the brushstrokes. Compare, for example, The Lace Maker with Morisot's Woman's Sewing, similar subject. When seen like this side by side with a typical work of Impressionism, it's not surprising that Dalí would characterize Vermeer's work as the product of a cold, objective painter, which is how he described him, who refused to let his subjective impressions interfere with the analytical inscription of the visible world. In other letters, Dalí likened Vermeer to a camera, that is, to an inhuman machine that records with complete disinterest and passivity the world as it is seen. In the painting by Morisot, by contrast, the visible brushstrokes speak less of the objects depicted and more of the personality of the painter, less of the sewing needle or the woman at work, and more of Morisot herself. Now, the contrast between this exceedingly restrained and exactingly precise technique of Vermeer on the one hand and the loose expressive gestures of Morisot on the other become even more emphatic by adjusting the size of the reproductions so they're in proper proportion. The painting by Vermeer is 9.5 by 8 inches, roughly, while the painting by Morisot is almost 3.5 times as large, 34 by 30 inches. And now for my fun with PowerPoint. The contrast is all the more apparent when one recognizes that one could fit 10.5 lace makers in the space occupied by Morisot's painting. Or one can see that the entire painting by Vermeer would fit inside the head of Morisot's young woman. In September of 1926, Dalí wrote to Lorca again, this time to tell him that he was looking forward to taking a trip to the Royal Museum in Brussels in order to, quote, copy, and he underlined the word copy, the Dutch painters. Unfortunately, there's no record of Lorca's response, so Lorca kept Dalí's letters to him. Dalí apparently didn't keep Lorca's letters, so we only have one side of the conversation. But Lorca must have been incredulous, because the next letter that Dalí wrote a few months later, March 1927, we find the following lines by Dalí. How could you ever think I don't really like the Dutch painters? Lorca's trying to figure out what precisely is it that so attracts Dalí. When you see what I'm doing now, you'll realize that you're wrong. That is to say, that they deserve to be admired. Lorca's puzzlement is entirely understandable, it seems to me, much more understandable than Dalí's apparently sincere attraction. For up until that point, almost everything that Dalí had painted spoke of a determined, albeit multi-directed, commitment to modern painting. The question that follows, of course, is this: was Dalí too aware of this apparent conflict between his attraction to Dutch painting and his relationship to modernism? And if so, to what end was he aware? Of all the works Dalí painted in the 1920s, the one to which he was most attached, and to which throughout his life he remained most attached, was this 12 by 12 inch painting, Basket of Bread, from 1926. Dalí considered it one of his masterpieces. He embedded references to it in a number of his subsequent paintings, and you can see some upstairs that have that, as well as going so far as to make a near copy of it in 1945, some 20 years later. It's painted with an even greater precision and meticulousness than Girl's Back, and as a result it glows with an almost mystical intensity. To give you an idea of the patient meticulousness of this painting, focus on the detail on the right. The entire painting is only 12 inches by 12 inches, which means that the detail on the right is just a few square inches. And of course, you can appreciate all of this when you go upstairs and see the paintings in the exhibition. Looking back at Dalí's development as a painter, it becomes clear that although paintings like Little Ashes, which you see on the upper left, furnished Dalí with the imagery that would characterize his work in the years to come, it was paintings like Girl's Back and Basket of Bread that furnished him with the technique. In terms of technique, paintings like the two I'm showing you here on the lower register, The Lugubrious Game and William Tell, owe nothing to the various modernist styles to which Dalí experimented so furiously in the 1920s. Instead, they're heir to Dalí's fascination with the old masters, and Vermeer in particular. At this point, it's worth pausing for a moment to consider the irony of all this. In the 10 years that separate the Impressionist painting on the left from 1921 and the Surrealist work for which he's so famous on the right from 1931, Dalí experimented with almost every major stylistic practice of modern painting. And yet, at the end of all of this, what he settled on was the technique of the one group of painters that all of the moderns, regardless of their individual inclinations or group commitments, had definitively abandoned. Ironically, at the end of this struggle to find his own true style, something that would be uniquely his, he settled on the only style that would be impossible for him to call his own. And because he ended up settling on a borrowed style, his paintings, like The Fishman and The Persistence of Memory, have the strange quality of seeming to refer to something else, to an outside or other that is there but not represented. Or rather, these paintings represent two things at once. First, what's there on the canvas, the figures and their implied narrative, and second, what is suggested by their recollection of paintings past. And this brings me to what I find most fascinating about Dalí's work, that something other to which the paintings seem to refer, regardless of what it is that the paintings actually depict. It is something that has nothing at all to do with what Dalí painted, and everything to do with how he painted. In relation to the established conventions of modern painting at the time, Dalí's style, his mimicry of old master techniques, is as alien and disorienting as his imagery. This, at least, is how Dalí himself understood what he was doing. But before getting into that, it's important to return to the mainstream of modern painting so as to make sense of some of its guiding principles. For these are the very principles against which Dalí's technique was meant to be understood. So what was it again about the paintings of the old masters that the moderns found most objectionable? The simple answer is that the old masters were just that, old. They were out of date and incompatible with modern life. More substantially, the problem was that they were perceived as having focused only on the surface of things, their outer skin. They failed to register the inner reality of the world, the hidden truth. The problem, in other words, was that the paintings of the old masters were superficial. Modern painting, by contrast, aimed to dig beneath the surface of things so as to access their inner nature and fundamental truth. Give an example. The true purpose of painting, wrote the critic Jacques Rivière in 1912, is to represent objects as they really are. That is to say, differently from the way we see them. It tends always to give us the sense. Modern painting tends always to give us their sensible essence, speaking in Platonic terms, their presence. And this is why the image it forms does not resemble their appearance. The understanding of modernism as hostile to superficial appearances and thus aimed at unveiling an inner essence was recently addressed by the philosopher Alain Badiou, who argued that the guiding ambitions of 20th century art and culture were animated by what he calls la passion du réel, the passion for the real, which is to say a deep-seated, irrational impulse to destroy any and all conventions in the name of direct, unmediated experience. That is, to bypass appearance that Rivière talks about so as to reach the essence. Badiou's assessment of 20th century culture has drawn a fair amount of attention in the past several years, but in fact it stands at the end of a long line of analysis that's been developing since the 1960s and 70s by people like Henri Pierre, Jeffrey Hartman, and perhaps most prominently Lionel Trilling, who argued in his 1971 book, Sincerity and Authenticity, that from the early modern period, beginning with Shakespeare, the question of how to see beneath the surface of things so as to discern the genuine from the fake, the sincere from the phony, was among the most salient, if not the most salient feature of modern art and literature. Trilling considered the modern fixation on authenticity as the response to a pervasive fear of deception, suggesting via Freud that civilization demands the repression of certain instincts and desires, and with this repression comes masquerade and deceit. So we're not able to act on our authentic instincts, we have to hide them, and thus modern life is fraught with deception all around. And if we go back further in time, past Trilling from 1971, to reach the period in which Dalí was painting, that is the 1920s, we find that the French philosopher Henri Bergson made a strikingly similar claim about human consciousness and the imperative of the artist. There's Bergson from around this period. Between nature and ourselves, he wrote, there is interposed a veil that is dense and opaque for the common herd, a veil that is thin, almost transparent for the artist. Thus, he continues, art, whether it be painting or sculpture, poetry or music, has no other object than to brush aside the utilitarian symbols, the conventional and socially accepted generalities. In short, everything that veils reality from us, in order to bring us face to face with reality itself. So what does all this have to do with Dalí? What is the relationship between Dalí's interest in old masters and Badiou's passion for the real, or Trilling's sincerity and Bergson's reality itself? The answer, it seems to me, lies in Dalí's interest not only in Vermeer, but more importantly, in the conjunction of this interest with something else, with Dalí's fascination with superficiality, with surfaces, illusions, and simulacra. In 1927, 1 year after writing to Lorca that he looked forward to copying the works of the Dutch masters, Dalí said this about himself: I am superficial, and the outside of things is what delights me. For in the last analysis, the outside of things is that which is objective. In a published essay from the same year, Dalí sounded a similar note. O marvelous mechanical industrial world, magnificent invitations to the senses and to the voyage of discovery of unknown objects, the gray rubber of tires, the clear glass of windshields, the soft tones of enchanting filter-tipped cigarettes, and the color of lips, golf bags, marmalades of all colors, pastries of delightful qualities. And then he ends, smooth surfaces, rough surfaces, polished surfaces, speckled surfaces. What Dalí is saying here in this letter to Lorca is that what he loves is not so much the things of modernity, the tires, the cigarettes, the golf bags, but more precisely the way that these modern things look. The outer surface of tires, the outer surface of cigarettes, the outer surface of a golf bag. That is the way they appear. In this, Dalí is confessing that he is in no way concerned with the modernist demand that artists lift the veil of illusion, as Bergson put it, so as to uncover the reality hidden beneath. Unlike Badiou, Dalí does not abide this passion for the real. Indeed, it seems for Dalí the world might just as well be one enormous veil, so long as that veil is beautiful to look at. Here is the conclusion that I draw from this. Dalí's paintings of this period, from his mimicry of divergent styles of modernism to his eventual adoption of the techniques of the old masters, is an effort to replace depth with surface and authenticity with artifice. In the 1920s, while Dalí was formulating this idea, his thoughts were scattered and inconsistent, and his intention is visible only in piecemeal fashion, by stitching together statements like the ones I've shown you here, that were sometimes made in public, sometimes made only in private, like those letters to Lorca. But in 1930, Dalí worked to formulate this concept cogently, although not all that cogent, in an essay he entitled The Sanitary Goat. The Sanitary Goat. The Sanitary Goat was published together with 3 other short essays in a small book entitled La Femme Visible, The Visible Woman. So I'm showing you here on the left the cover of the book and the frontispiece on the right. Of these four texts, The Sanitary Goat has received the least attention by scholars. I think because it doesn't help us much with the struggle to understand Dalí's imagery. There's very little there in the text that explains why he's drawn to ants or clocks or cork or sand on the ground. For that, the other texts in La Femme Visible are much more useful. But when it comes to making sense not of what Dalí painted, but how he painted, it is, in my opinion, the most important text in all of Dalí's career. The essay begins with a critique of modern art at large. He says that it's infected by what he calls a lingering impressionism, and he attributes this lingering impressionism directly to Bergson, whom he mentions by name. Bergson's error, according to Dalí, is to respond to the threat of deception by shrinking back, by turning inward to the immediate data of the senses. This, he claims, merely concedes the problem without solving it. For if the question is the reality of one's experience, then to focus only on the impressions that we have, the impressions that this reality makes, will never answer the question about reality itself. For Dalí, the only legitimate response to the threat of deception is to embrace illusion itself, to celebrate the superficial world of images, and in doing so to put an end to the Bergsonian ambition altogether. That is to say that what is real is only the surface. There is nothing real underneath. In The Sanitary Goat, Dalí claims that there is a moment. This is, I think, one of the most fascinating parts about this essay. There is a moment when reality and its representation start to pull away from each other. A moment when a picture no longer serves to represent the world, but rather makes its own world. And he calls this moment the gratuitous point, because it is at this point that an image becomes gratuitous. It no longer serves its original representational function, and instead acts according to its own internal dynamic. Dalí's analysis of this concept is far from straightforward, and I think it's best understood by turning to the principal example that Dalí gives in this essay. Here's what he writes. A gratuitous point might take shape, for example, in the gesture of a person who, without knowing how to play the piano, imitates perfectly on a marble table the confident fingerings of a true pianist, convinced of the absolute similarity of his imitation. This geometric point would materialize precisely at the moment when the fake pianist would lose for a moment his absolute faith in his imitation, but would continue with it nonetheless and with no less enthusiasm. Again, I want to point out that in terms of the imagery evoked in this example, there's really nothing strange at all. It's a simple scene of someone pretending to play the piano. What Dalí wants us to recognize here is that the apparently ordinary act of pretending is itself potentially both strange and disorienting. Dalí makes no direct connection in this essay between the concept of the gratuitous point and the paintings he was completing at the time. And I think that may be another reason why this essay hasn't been studied, because you could look to the others to find examples. He'll give references, and then you could go to his catalog of paintings and you'll see precisely what he's referring to. But you don't see examples of someone pretending to play the piano on a marble slab. The essay, by the way, was written in 1930, the same year as he completed The Fishman. This essay nonetheless suggests a way to approach paintings like these. It suggests that we think about these paintings as gratuitous points, that is, as representations that have at some point detached themselves from the world of reality that they had once been connected to, or at least they thought themselves connected to. Remember that the fake pianist only believed himself to be mimicking the gestures of a real pianist. Critics and scholars of Dalí's surrealist paintings argue that they should be understood as having abandoned the realm of the visible, the realm of outer reality, for the invisible world of inner reality, the world of the unconscious. But this is not at all what Dalí is saying in this essay, The Gratuitous Point. If we're to understand Dalí's paintings according to the example he gives here, then they're not to be understood as faithful representations of the dream world. In fact, they are to be understood as altogether false representations, as images without reference, copies without a model. And here I'm coming to my conclusion. And this brings us back to Dalí's assessment of Vermeer as a surrealist avant la lettre. Like the lace maker, which measures just 9.5 by 8 inches, the persistence of memory is a tiny painting, 13 inches wide. Like the lace maker, it was painted with exquisite patience, precision, and attention to surfaces. Vermeer's example, it seems, demonstrated to Dalí that an art of superficiality can, if properly exploited, become as disorienting as any dream or daytime fantasy. Consider finally the figure in the middle ground. It is a rendering of Dalí's own face, the upper portion at any rate. We see Dalí in profile with his forehead to the left and what appears to be his neck stretching out and disappearing to the right. His left eye is closed and his long and elegant lashes curl gently upward, while his thick and sharp nose points downward and drips blood or mucus from its nostril, or perhaps it's a tongue. The shapelessness of the face suggests a deflated balloon or an empty sac, as if the inner organs and blood vessels have been sucked out by a syringe or a vacuum. So what remains is thus a portrait of the painter as pure surface, as all skin and no bones, all outside and no inside, all appearance and no essence. It is literally then a personification of the concept of superficiality, a concept Dalí claims to have gleaned from Vermeer, a concept that, as he understood it, worked to disturb, if not to destroy, modernism's ambition to lift the veil of appearances and thus come face to face with reality itself. Thank you.